Welcome to First Christian Church's Adult Fellowship Bible Study. We continue in our study of Revelation with today's session covering chapter 17. Recall last time the seven and final series of plagues were revealed, called the bowl plagues or the wrath plagues, and they report out on earth in chapters 15 and 16. Many scholars label chapter 17 as the vision of the fall of Babylon. Several of the more evangelical sources, however, usually indicate this is the most difficult chapter in all of Revelation for them to interpret using their paradigm. Some academic scholars start their reviews of this chapter with an opening line like this: the seventh bowl plagues are the climax of God's judgment. The fall of Babylon is here, which we've learned throughout, but re-emphasize here, is a code word for the Roman Empire, says Dr. Eugene Boring at Texas Christian University in his compendium. The late Dr. Bruce Metzler at Princeton Theological adds, and John now seems certain that even greater and sustained persecution of the church will take place. And so he's trying to prepare his people for that. Metzger taught that it is important we moderns appreciate that that for John to have said Rome here would have been considered an act of treason against Rome, and not just being considered as some act of superstition by what they considered an atheist. That is, anyone who didn't follow the Roman religion was looked at as an atheist and superstitious. So if he'd have said Rome, things would have been a lot worse for both he personally and for the Christian community. Such would have made matters much worse. Thus, John has been writing Revelation in code, says Dr. Bruce Metzger in his book or compendium entitled Breaking the Code. As a matter of survival, he says, he's writing this way. That is both his survival, so he can continue to prophesy and preach, although in this case through writing and distance, to his Christian community, and that hopefully lessen the pressure on the community. After all, this is 90s AD, Metzger says, and not 300 AD or 400 or 500 AD. 300 AD specifically referring to when Rome accepts Christianity as its state religion, or at least starts in and about that time. Now, they were very much in 90s AD aimed at wiping out alternative faiths, not just particularly Christians, but any alternative faith that would not yield to worshiping that emperor. Thus, John pictures Rome here as even more revolting than we have seen earlier in his descriptions. She is now a whore, courting the world, and she's drunk on the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, who she calls to be slain. Several scholars say this is one of the most direct indications in the book of Revelation that John's real focus is on the religious system of Rome and not necessarily who is ruling. It's their failure to support or allow Christianity in its fullest that is the problem. In verse 3, the angel takes John in the spirit into the wilderness. Scholars teach us that we must understand what that word wilderness means here in apocalyptic thinking or apocalyptic literature. It does not mean what we normally think of wilderness. It means a place of refuge and quiet for the people of God. A place where they can clear their mind of distractions and assess the reality of what is happening. Thus, John, in such, would envision, so since he's now in such a place, he can now envision the pagan city as the most successful prostitute and woman around, while Jerusalem was depicted throughout the Old Testament as a pure virgin. And such is classic Jewish thinking in the prophetic tradition, and John is going there in his thought process. And now the scholars say he's brought that in and used that to now refer to Rome and the Roman Empire, then in the opposite of Jerusalem. Instead of a pure virgin, a prostituting whore. Such scholars point out that this imagery and wording also fit a historic, non-Christian writing about Nero's persecution of Christians in 60s AD, after the Great Fire of Rome, where he blamed Christians. Very similar wording. And there are some schools of thought that would suggest that John is aware of that, and he is using that imagery. Of course, others then are suggesting, no, that's John is describing more or less the same thing, and therefore Revelation is written closer to 60s AD and not 90s AD. Dr. Christopher Rowland, the Anglican scholar of Queen's College, Oxford, England, teaches that John is summoned to witness the judgment of this great whore, which is Babylon in the storyline. Isaiah 23 is his likely source of this imagery, Rowland suggests. Early Judeo-Christian theology holds the individual responsible for allowing himself to become trapped. The beast, or Babylon, Rome, if you will, is requiring them to worship the power of the beast that the beast represents, that is Satan. But making the decision to obey Rome and to do so and worship the emperor versus not obeying and surely dying at the hands of the beast is the individual's responsibility. Thus, the individual is accountable to God for his actions and his decisions. And in verse 8, it seems John sees all succumbing to this pressure except those written in the book of life. Those, Revelation indicates, those names were written there from the foundation of the world. That scripture is very difficult to interpret. To be honest with you, most of the scholars just totally leave it alone. Some scholars suggest that suggests it means the statement is maybe understood from this standpoint, that the names are written from the foundation of earth, that all names are originally written there, and that your name gets removed based on your thoughts and actions. That's the point of accountability. Of course, the alternative school of interpreting that statement is what's generally referred to predestination theology. Verse 9 gets much attention from the scholars concerning the wisdom statement that's there. It appears the angel is saying, this why he's decoding this vision for John. And that is, in verses 9 through 14, the angel is actually decoding the vision for John. Now, normally in Revelation, we haven't seen John's visions being decoded. Here, they are. Some suggest it is bringing John maybe back down to earth, as one scholar puts it. I like this. He says maybe he's gotten a little wild-eyed. But others suggest this is consistent with Jewish apocalyptic approach to writing, in that there they usually give detailed interpretation of the vision by an angel. In other words, some angel interprets it for the person, states Dr. Eugene Boring. This is the only place we see this happening, that is, this interpretation of the vision in the book of Revelation. So some suggest John is here actually using an Old Testament or an apocalyptic thought that's already out there and has been interpreted, and he's just fully using it as Jewish material and the way the Jewish community would have done it. Dr. Christopher Rowland teaches that what verse 9 onward teaches about the beast description remains a mystery today. He hasn't seen convincing evidence or convincing interpretation to convince him what's there, he says. He and others speculate it may have been used as such even by John, that John just left it there. That it wasn't something with much interpretation or pre-meaning to these people. Boring says whatever that description of the beast means, though, that is, all these various heads and so forth, seems to be highly symbolic and not to be taken literally. Did John's audience understand it? Most of the scholars suggest maybe they didn't. That it is a form of bewilderment that's left there. Of course, we don't know. We don't see the evidence in other writings to suggest one way or the other. Most believe it had something to do, though, with Rome's leadership. That's about as much consistency as you can glean from the scholars. He says maybe we can conclude that this series of emperors is bad and it's coming to an end, or their ability to rule is coming to an end and is being replaced by God's rule as they conquer, the Lamb's actions conquer, and God's rule is established through him on earth. The symbolic language resonates with several levels of meaning, though, states most scholars, especially Bourne is very strong on this. John clearly involves the hearer and reader, he says, their imagination in this chapter. He and others advise that we cannot infer a one-to-one decoding of this symbolism. So he's a little bit there taking issue in some cases with Dr. Metzger, in that Metzger tends to go with a one-to-one conversion of those decodes, but Boring and some others, they think it's a little more complex than that. Rather, there seems to be multiple meanings to these symbols, and that they seem to be at various levels and intertwined both between level and between one another. So, in other words, it's a contorted, complicated symbolism. Boring cites that some have suggested this may relate to the great mother goddess of the ancient Near East. That is, that she became the goddess Roma for the Roman Empire, and is considered the giver to the Roman Empire of all the blessings that occur to the Roman Empire, just as in Greek mythology that a similar goddess was claimed for the Greeks. There are temples to Roma in Ephesus, Smyrna and Perga, that is three of these cities where John's churches were. We learned that back there in chapter 2 of Revelation. And all people were expected to worship Roma at those temples. Thus, John's Christians may have considered that goddess the whore here. There are many scholars who tend to lean in that direction, rather than clearly rejecting her as their mother goddess or any concept that there's any sub-gods other than the Judeo-Christian God. Thus, based on the Judeo-Christian ethic of the time, those pagans worshiping Roma, or this mother goddess, are committing fornication with that goddess of another religion. Many scholars suggest it may be reduced to something that simple. Such was classic idolatry thinking in the Judeo-Christian thinking of the time in the Old Testament and in the Apocryphal writings. So this is not too much of a stretch. And so some sort of suggest that this may not be as complicated as we think it is, and that there's a lot of noise made here, but in the end it's fairly simple. In verse 8 through 12, Dr. Boring suggests here the description of the beast, which the woman is seated, that is the portrayal of Rome and her relationship with the religion. That is, the woman represents the religion and the beast represents Rome. It appears he is making much parody there in that system with the true God, however. And the reason for that would be it's so that it would be close enough to be awful tempting for a Christian, rather than dying, to say, well, that's not too far away and I'll go there. So that you can be a good deceiver, a good deceptive concept is kind of where they're at. That this has to be presented in such a way that is close enough that true Christian, or that Christian at the point of making the decision, has a very deceptive option in front of them, and if they're not very wise and careful, they can be easily fooled. Thus, maybe John is trying to blow the deceptive cover here and reveal what Roman society at large is really worshiping. Moreover, he says, God is allowing such evil to be used to achieve God's purpose. That is, Rome is a victim of Satan. It has been deceived, and thus not the ultimate source of the evil. Rather, Satan is. That is the rationale Boring suggests that may be behind all this, and why it requires a wise mind to discern and not be deceived and trapped by what's presented in front of us. Dr. David Brackey at Ohio State University reflects that we in modern society have been taught Rome's many benefits to human civilization. Thus, to appreciate and discern Revelation's message, we must understand John's foundational view. He sees only two kinds of people: true Christians and everyone else. There's no gray. Rome, in his day, in John's day, was not Christian. Not even in name only, he says. John sees people worshiping one of two beings. The God with a capital G, that is the Judeo-Christian God that Christians believe in, or a demonic beast or Satan that they're worshiping in those pagan temples. Thus Rome and its emperors work for Satan, and they require all to worship Satan as government policy. Essentially, what they are doing is the same as the abomination of desolation, he says, that was taught back there in the book of Maccabees. A most sinful of sins, a most evil of evils, when forced to pay homage to another god. John here foresees a way out, though. It is a great war between God and Satan that is pictured here as the beast, in order to eliminate the evil influence that deceives humans, he says. That idea is classic apocalyptic thought. At its core, teaches Dr. Jerry Sumney at Lexington Theological Seminary. Foundational is this idea that God created Satan as eternal, and humans were created with free will to decide. But God holds humans accountable for making decisions, I should say. God will remove the deceiver, is how John seems to view the means by which God establishes his kingdom on earth. We can watch how this plays out over the next several chapters to the end of the book. I hope this gives you some idea of how the scholars, academic and religious scholars, view this chapter. Hope to see you next week.